Buckminster Fuller. How many of you have heard of him? A lot of you. Okay. He was an environmentalist, an activist, an architect, an engineer, a poet, an inventor, and one of the unique geniuses of the 20th century. His lifetime spanned an incredible period of scientific advancement. He died in 1983 at the age of 89, and he spent the last 7 years of his life in a little town called DeLand, Florida, which just happens to be the home to my alma mater, Stetson University. How many of you have heard of DeLand or Stetson University? Not as many. I didn't think so. So see, just by coming to church today, we've already increased your knowledge of the world. Let me tell you a little bit about Buckminster Fuller. Born in 1895, the year the wireless telegraph was invented and the X-ray was discovered. By the time he was 27, the scientific community knew of only one galaxy, our own, the Milky Way. By the next year, as you know, the astronomer Hubble discovered another galaxy. In the 50 years that followed, 2 billion galaxies were discovered, each averaging over 150 billion stars. Let your mind wrap around that for a moment. And it was during this period that Buckminster Fuller made his contributions to the world of science. He's the holder of countless patents. He's remembered for the invention of the geodesic dome, a sphere, some of which are now constructed hundreds of feet in diameter, that has no inner supporting structures. It is supported only by the skin of its interlocking polygons. He also created the Dyamaxon map and discovered synergetic mathematics. I don't understand that. Maybe David Underwood does, and he can explain it to us later. He also coined the phrase, Spaceship Earth. And if you've ever been to Disney's Epcot Center in Florida, you have heard that phrase a lot. By his own account, Buckminster Fuller was an ambitious young man, but he said early in life he lived largely off the ideas of other people. The result was that by 1927 he was penniless, and he was discredited in the science community. His 4 factories had closed, and he lost all the money that his family and friends had invested in him. Even worse, his 4-year-old daughter Alexandria died of polio and spinal meningitis. So at the age of 32, he considered himself wasted. So he walked to the edge of the lakefront in Chicago, deeply despondent, and for the first time in his life, he contemplated suicide. And it was in that dark night of the soul that he heard and discovered a life-changing truth. You are not made for yourself. You are made for a higher purpose. And those thoughts led him into a deeper search for the meaning of life, and he said he would spend every night contemplating, pondering the words of Jesus in the Lord's Prayer. He would later write in his book, Critical Path, I learned to commit myself to the advantage of all humanity, instead of committing my efforts exclusively to the advantage of my dependents, myself, my country, my people, my team. Buckminster Fuller had made one of life's critical discoveries. He found a second faith. Now, the story I have shared with you is not uncommon or as rare as you might think. Indeed, the sacred record of all the world's religions is full of stories about individuals, their struggles, and their search to find a second faith, a more mature faith. That's why we still read and ponder these ancient accounts of Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Jeremiah and Mary and Martha and the people who followed Jesus, because we're hoping that reading about their discoveries of a greater faith will help us to find our second faith. So we're told today in the Scriptures that one day the disciples made a request of Jesus. increase our faith. For once, the disciples seem to have gotten it right. They asked for a good thing, because usually Jesus was admonishing them for their lack of faith. We have to hear this request for more faith in light of Jesus' teachings and commands about discipleship. If we had time and could go back and read the previous chapters in Luke's Gospel, you would see that Jesus makes very challenging demands upon his followers. For example, in the parable of the dishonored manager, he concludes by saying, "No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth." Later, Jesus would preach about forgiveness, saying that if any person sins against you 7 times a day and turns back to you 7 times and says, "I repent," you must forgive them. And then there's this shocking hyperbole in this parable, the point of which Jesus says we are to do our spiritual duty without thought of reward. Does a boss thank a servant for doing what is commanded? So also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, "We've only done what we ought to have done." No wonder the disciples said, "Increase our faith." What's surprising is Jesus' answer. He says a small amount of faith is enough. Just a tiny grain of mustard seed is enough to move a tree. In other words, the faith you already have is enough to change the world, or at least your own world. But often, it takes a time of crisis for us to move and discover that second faith. Years ago, someone you probably don't know is Mary Clark Moschella. She had graduated from divinity school, but she couldn't find a job with a church. You see, the denomination she was in at the time would not give women a chance to be a pastor. She ended up broke. She says she would have been homeless if friends and family hadn't have taken her in. Day after day, she was going through job applications, searching for a way to maybe do ministry and earn a living too. It was near Christmas time, and she realized she needed income, even if it wasn't going to be from doing ministry. She scoured some job ads in her hometown of Boston, and she found one for someone to play Santa Claus at the mall. Or you could be a talking Christmas tree. But it turned out they only hired men to be the Santa Clauses, and female talking trees weren't paid very much. Just after this, though, she discovered another ad, and it said they were looking for an associate minister at the Memorial Church United Church of Christ in Sudbury, Massachusetts. And the rest, as they say, is history. Because today she is the distinguished Dr. Mary Clark Moschella, professor of pastoral care and counseling at Yale Divinity School. She's an accomplished author. She's one of our leading scholars. You see, sooner or later, at some point in all our lives, it's going to happen. In fact, we will do it. For good or for ill, for better or for worse, rightly or wrongly, one way or the other, every one of us here and everyone passing by in their cars outside this morning will face the ultimate challenge of faith, moving from a first early faith to a second, more mature faith. And that's the type of faith the world really needs. A creative, new faith that can toss mulberry trees into the ocean. For most of us, our first faith was largely inherited. We received it from our family, our church, if we had one, our religious environment, even from our country. Some of us here were spiritually disadvantaged at birth by circumstances not of our own choosing. Others of us here were in a position of advantage, again, not by our own doing. We had things, we owned things, we believed things that somebody else handed down to us. And furthermore, many of our early commitments in life and careers and relationships may have been totally impulsive, a reaction to the emotion of the moment. Whether we chose to be for faith or against it, for church or not, for someone against others, but sooner or later, each of us comes to that time where we can have a second faith in life, our own. The disciples asked for more faith. Jesus tells them, you already have it. It's within you. It's just in seed form. And what is true for individuals is also true for churches. Today is the first Sunday in October, World Communion Sunday. Maybe you grew up in a church that observed this day, or maybe you, like I, grew up in one that did not. Maybe you didn't grow up in church at all, and you've never even heard of World Communion Sunday. But this is the day on the Christian calendar that calls us to be and recognize a truly universal, global, inclusive church. It came out of what's called the modern-day ecumenical movement. Ecumenical is just a good biblical word in the Greek. It means the household of God. The day was first observed by the Presbyterians, 1936. It was later adopted by the Federal Council of Churches in 1940. And today, most mainline Protestant churches observe it. It took almost 2,000 years of arguing and fighting and splitting about whose creed, whose interpretation of the Christian faith was correct, that created literally thousands of different Christian denominations and sects. Someone finally got a second faith and suggested, why don't we honor the differences in our faith and practices? Why don't we put love and relationships first? And why don't we work together for common concerns? Because if the church, if the Christian faith can't work together, how in the world do we expect the world to listen to our message? You know, one of the benefits of Family Promise, in addition to what it does for the families, is that it has brought together dozens of congregations that are very, very different. And for that, I'm thankful. Our congregation, our church, is truly ecumenical and diverse. We come to this place of worship and service from almost every imaginable faith background. And we hold different beliefs and interpretations about many things. But most of us are here because somewhere along the way in life's journey, we found a second faith. One that accepts, respects, welcomes diversity. We refuse to passively accept the faith that's just passed on to us. We are open to new possibilities and interpretations for now and the future. We are a church for people who want to have their faith challenged, who want to grow and mature. And for people of such faith, like Buckminster Fuller or Mary Clark Moschella, they will move mountains. They will grow from diversity and adversity. They will help change the world for the better. But then again, such servants are not to be congratulated. After all, Jesus said, they're just doing what God expected of them in the first place.